If you got the email, or if you've had a chance to check your email, you will have seen that in the reminder I sent out, I included the tool to be able to follow along as we're talking about contracts today. I would suggest either open it up, print it out so you can take notes. If you didn't happen to get that in your email, I'm going to pop it over in the chat box, so don't worry. You'll still have access to it right now, and then I'll also send it out again in my normal after event email. So thank you for joining us today for our ACE Contracts webinar. We're going to be talking a bit about contract requirements and best practices. We're going to talk about that great tool that you can utilize for your program, give you some heads up about upcoming events, and of course have time for questions and answers. I'm Sarah Brightwell. I think at this point I've met most of you, at least virtually. I am on the OIETA team providing technical assistance for the various grant programs, and then I'll turn it over to Bianca.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you all know me by now as well. I'm your program officer, and I will turn it over to Colin.
Hi, Colin Bishop, Office of General Counsel. I've been on a couple of these webinars already, so it's nice to see folks again.
Now I'll present the contract requirements. Next slide. So procurement transactions made with grant funds, hold on, my screen needs to move, must be conducted in a manner providing full and open competition, consistent with the standards as set forth under uniform guidance at 2 CFR 200.317-.326. Use procurement procedures to select contractors, provided that those procedures meet the standards described in the uniform guidance. In improving your application, Ed has not approved any of the entities. Sorry, everything keeps popping up and I can't see. Entities or individuals that you may have identified in your application as an evaluator, service provider, or other potential contractor. You must select all contractors in accordance with the requirements above. Next slide. If you want more information about the uniform guidance, you can use this link listed right here. To the greatest extent feasible, you must give Indian preference for training and employment opportunities in connection with the administration of this grant, and to give Indian organizations and Indian-owned economic enterprises as defined in Section 3 of the Indian Financing Act of 1974. Preference in the award of contracts in connection with the administration of this grant. Next slide. So these are the general requirements. If you are not in a planning period, you should have submitted all of your sample agreements and the list of providers on Monday, November 16th. Please submit those if you haven't yet. And then if you are in a planning period, you would provide your sample written agreement and the list of providers once your planning period ends. Next slide. Remember that all of your service provider contract costs must be within that 80% allowance for direct services, and that the 80% limit starts after your planning period is over. You can also have contracts as part of the service selection method and or parent feedback process, but those come out of the 15% for ACE structural costs after the planning period ends. And you also can have contracts within your planning period if you are using contractors to set up any of the structural costs and so on. Next slide. So these are some more of the contract requirements, and it has to be within every single contract. You must include a non-discrimination clause. You also need a description of how the grantee will oversee the service provider and hold the provider accountable for the terms of the written agreement, the use of funds, including compliance with generally accepted accounting procedures and federal cost principles. You also need a description of how students' progress will be measured, and a provision for the termination of the agreement if the provider is unable to meet the terms of the agreement. Next slide. So the per student costs. Grantees must set a per student cost. This cost definitely the contractor should be aware of. Decide whether the costs are monthly or annual. Decide how to allocate quantity of services to each student. So we're going to go over a couple of examples. In this example, there's a maximum amount, a dollar amount for each student, which is $250. So a family can select from the menu that you provide services that have a specific price. And in another example, you can provide credits. So each student can have a maximum of 5 credits. Each family can then select from a menu of services that instead has a price is associated to a credit. Grantees set the price in credits. Lower cost services may be fewer credits, while higher cost services are more credits. So again, if a service is $500, maybe it's the 5 credits, but then if you can find services that are like 2 and 3, maybe you $300, you might associate the 100 to a credit, and so on. And then each family selects up to a set number of total services per student. So you do need to figure out, the maximum allowance. And if you provide that in a dollar format or credit format, it is up to you. Next slide. So again, every service option must have a cost per student, whether it is being offered by a service provider or the grantee. So again, if you're providing those services, you also should know exactly how much it will cost to serve each student. The cost per student should include all expenses associated with that particular service. So any supplies that's needed, any transportation, salaries to pay the actual service providers, our teachers, or whoever is giving the service, that all needs to be included in that per student cost. The cost per student multiplied by the number of students served should be the total contract amount for each provider. So I'll explain that in another slide, sorry. Cost per students can be negotiated with each provider or set by the grantee. For research during the planning period, so costs are reasonable. For those in the planning period, the cost per student can be an estimate at this point. However, cost per students must be set through the contract process prior to providing the actual services. So again, please work with your service providers and contracts to agree upon a cost per student price, so you know how many students you can allow when you are providing services. Next slide. So how can we calculate this cost per student? I know everyone was given a set amount per year, but we also know that 80% of the funds that we are given during the service years, that 80% has to go to students for direct services. So the number of services, so you need to know how many services and providers you will have. What will be the per student cost multiplied by the number of students for that service for each provider. Make sure to consider whether the per student cost is per week, month, year, or etc. And again, please be flexible in the contracts as well too. You do not want a contract for 5 years and you're stuck with a service where students are not selecting that service. So please, think about if you want to, you know, have a cost per week or month, or a contract that is based on the time frame that works for you. Next slide. So here's a couple of examples to calculate the cost per student. So for the budget for the direct services, they have $365,000, and they're going to serve 200 students, or their estimate of students would be 200. So in this example, they have 2 providers of native language instruction. The annual cost is $1,000 per student. They're estimating 100 students will choose this native language. And then the contract will be $100,000 for contract. So if there's another one for 3 providers of math tutoring, the annual cost would be $700 per student times 50 students would be $35,000 a contract. And if there's 3 contracts, it'll be $105,000 for 150 students. And this example, 2 providers of tribal drumming and dance instruction. So the cost for that would be $600 per student, and an estimate of 50 students will select drumming or dance instruction. So the estimate contract should be $30,000. If there's 2 contracts for that service, of course, it would be $60,000 serving up to 100 students. So, you know, sometimes it's easier to have the total amount that the contract is charging and then divide it by the estimated amount of students that you will be serving. Next slide. How cost per student appears to parents. Again, you do not have to give the dollar amount per services. You can show it to parents and families as credits. In this option, they use credits. So for option A, student A can use up to 15 credits per year. Native language maybe is more expensive, so that's 10 credits. Math tutoring is 5 credits, and tribal drumming and dance instruction is 5 credits. So in this example, the student Bianca chooses language, which is 10 credits, and drumming, which is 5 credits. So my total is 15. And Colin, he only chooses math and drumming, which are 5. So his total credits are 10 credits. And then Sarah, she chose language and math. So her total credits is 15 credits. So this is just a way for you to have families choose their options without going over the maximum that you can allow. Next slide. So here's option B. If you wanted to show it and with funds and money, you can allow, in this option, or this example, they allow up to $1,700 per year for students. And the native language instruction costs $1,000. The math tutoring costs $700, and tribal drumming costs $500. So again, I chose language and drumming, so my total will be the $1,500. Colin chose math and drumming, so his total would be $1,000. Sarah chose language and math, and her total is $1,700. Next slide. So another option is just providing the maximum amount of services they can choose from. So if all your services are maybe around the same amount of funds, and you wanted to give every student or family, 2 or 3 options per year, then of course they can choose, a maximum or 2 to 3 options. So there's 2 services that was selected by each student. The maximum is 2 services. And of course you can have more than 3 options, but you definitely need to know, the maximum that each student can choose from. Next slide. So going back to the cost per students with the contracts, for the native language instruction, there's 10 credits or $1,000. Contracts can cover up to 200 students. So make sure that, you know, you're aware of how many students can be provided under each contract. For the math tutoring, 5 credits or $700. The contract can cover up to 150 students. So you're only allowed maximum 150 students with the example that was given. And then same with drumming, there's either 5 credits or $600. So the contract would be able to cover up to 100 students. Next slide. So what about contract adjustments? This is something, you know, hopefully we can write some good contracts that can be flexible, but here's some good tips. What if all 200 students choose native language and none choose the 2 other services? So it's very important that during your planning period, you are doing that outreach to families to see what they're interested in, and we are not selecting a service that families will not choose from. It's important because, of course, the contractors, when they sign the agreement, they would like to get paid as well too. So please do not make contracts with service providers that the students and families are just not interested in. And what if all 200 students want drumming, but the contract is only for 50 students? Again, this is where you can get your input from the families that you'll be serving. And then if you do need to make a revision or change in your budget, you always can submit a revision and change to myself and to negotiate that contract with that service provider. The third question is, what if only a few students want drumming and it's not enough students for the service provider to have a class? And I think this is very important to note as well too, that you really need your parent input and plan for this possibility in your contract with the service provider. In your contract, you can say there will be a minimum of, 20 kids enrolled. So, the minimum payment may be $100,000, but their maximum payment, if everyone enrolls, will be the $365,000. I believe that example we're using. And then the fourth question, what if all 100 students want a provider A for language and none want provider B? So again, please do not make contracts with service providers families are not interested in, but maybe the families are not aware of the service provider. There could be several things that we can check on too, like if your selection method, maybe they don't see that option or it just wasn't promoted as the other ones. Maybe there's things we can change to increase the likeliness of it. But you can or may need to cancel the contract with B and again revise your budget and submit that revision to myself. Next slide.
Well, and Bianca, before we go to the next slide, we actually had 2 questions that might be good to address in this spot. One of them is for like scenario 1, where all the kids decided they wanted native language and not necessarily the other 2 services you had on your menu of options. Other than the parent input importance, is it actually allowable to then only be offering one service?
So there definitely needs to be options for students. So there needs to be more than one service offered to each family and student. So we probably would need to revise and get something that still fits the scope of your project.
Okay. And then the next question was to clarify, since it appears students need to be tracked on an individual, personally identifiable basis, it doesn't sound like it would be allowable to provide classes like dance or language, culture camp, or tutoring that would welcome and count all who wish to attend. So more of just kind of open enrollment. Maybe you're offering it and they can just come if they wish. It sounds like it would need to be something set up a little differently.
Yes, everything offered needs to be selected by the families. Again, this is completely different than previous demonstration funding that you can, if you do know after your planning period that several students do want dance or language, and now you want to offer it as an after school program or maybe a summer camp or something, and you know that those students will select that option, then you definitely can plan with that contractor to provide that service for those students who select it. But you cannot just have, please do not plan like conferences or just classes until you know that people are interested in attending, and that will be a selection that they choose from the list of options.
Great, thanks.
And now I will be turning it over to Colin.
Okay, great. Thanks. So we're going to talk about this contract tool, which is, another phrase for the sample contract, the Word document that is available to everybody in the chat. So like Sarah said at the very beginning, we recommend you open it up now, have it also on half your screen so that we can have a better conversation about this contract. Next slide, please. So a couple important things right off the bat. This is a sample that is supposed to help you. You are not required to use this contract tool, but there are some specific things that must be in your contracts with service providers. So I know we've gotten some questions already about maybe an organization that already has a standard contract that they use with their service providers. That's fine. You can keep using your standard contract. You don't have to use this sample that we're giving you today. However, according to the NIA for this grant, there were a handful of things that absolutely must be in contracts with service providers. Bianca hit on those earlier. I'm going to touch on them again. It's the non-discrimination clause, how you're going to hold your service providers accountable, something about measuring student progress, and then also something about how you can end that contract if the service provider is not meeting the terms of the contract. So if those things are already in your agreements with service providers, great. If you're using a standard agreement that doesn't have those, you're going to need to put them in. But you do not need to use this specific Word document. It's just here to help you. You can see in the Word document that where there are things that are related to those requirements from the NIA, they're highlighted with like a little comment on the side that calls out what the NIA requirement was. So those are the sections that are specifically addressing those NIA requirements, and maybe you just pull those out of here and put them into your standard contract if you have one. Again, it's up to you. And then just finally, if your organization has a lawyer or someone who regularly does contracts, that's the person to talk to about this, because they can definitely help you out. Next slide, please. So here's a screenshot of what the Word document looks like. It has a whole bunch of sections. The first section is just what it is. It's an agreement. It's called a service provider agreement here. That's the same thing as a contract. In the NIA, it's called a written agreement. Those are all the same things. Section 2 is a few definitions. Section 3 is the term, meaning how long this contract is going to go on for. That's something that you all need to figure out with your service providers. We'll talk about that on a future slide. Number 4 is about services. Number 5 is about how you're going to measure student progress. Number 6 is management and oversight. Number 7 is payment and financial requirements. Sorry, that was 7 is payment and financial requirements. 8 is student privacy. 9 is non-discrimination. 10 is termination. And 11 is effectiveness and date. So you can already tell just by looking at some of these section titles, a lot of what's in this contract, again, and it's just suggested, a lot of what's in this contract is sort of laying out how you would, sort of laying out your relationship with that service provider. What is the management going to be like? Are you going to have weekly meetings? Are you going to have monthly meetings? Are you going to expect them to send you information about how the students are performing? So it's not just, you know, hey, we're going to pay you X number of dollars per student per month, go to it. There's also a lot of stuff in here that's really sort of talking about how you're going to have a productive, good relationship with your service providers so that they are doing, like really meeting the goals of your project. Again, and this is, it's a sample, it's suggested, but I think a lot of these things can really be helpful in setting expectations. Next slide, please. Okay, so section 1, like I said, is just the basic opening. Section 2 has some definitions, and you know, those are pretty straightforward. Section number 3 is the term. Again, that's the start and end dates of this contract. I know we've gotten some questions already about, you know, should we be signing up a service provider? You know, if you have a 5-year project, should we sign up a service provider right now for all 5 years? I'm not going to tell you yes or no, but the best practice would be don't lock yourself in with a certain provider for your full contract. Maybe you want to do it annually. Maybe you want to do it by semester, because as we know, part of this grant program is now that parents have choice, and that over time, new providers might come on or some providers might drop off. So you really want to make sure that your contracts are either, well, are probably shorter. And also within those contracts, you want to make sure that you have flexibility so that if you know, if no one signs up for a class, then you don't have to keep paying the service provider for a class that no one's taking. I just want to say explicitly that you, the grantee, are responsible legally for the grant funds and how they get used. So you want to make sure that you are being a good steward of these federal dollars. And so you want to make sure that you're supervising these service providers well. And part of that is, you know, making sure that you have contracts that allow you some flexibility there. And that's going to be sort of a highlight as we go through some more of these slides. Next slide, please. So if we're looking at section 4 of the contract, and then subsections 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, 4.4, 4.5. Again, this comes back to some of those, both establishing what your sort of your relationship with the service providers, and also some of the really important substantive requirements of the NIA for this project, for this program. So subsection 4.1, this is where you can lay out exactly what educational services this service provider is going to provide. You'll remember from the NIA in the program requirements section, there's a long list of what kinds of educational services are appropriate for this grant. You all obviously submitted applications that with a specific scope and specific objectives, and you should be selecting service providers that are able to provide services that fit within your scope and objectives. If there are changes to what is in your approved application, or you want to make changes to what's in your approved application, you really need to talk to Bianca about that as soon as possible. As a general matter, the department OIE does not approve changes to the scope or objectives of your approved application, but other smaller changes are generally allowable. Again, that's something to talk to Bianca about. Subsection 4.2 is cost. You want to put in there clearly how much the service provider is going to get paid. We've gotten the question previously, do I have to contract with providers on a per student cost? So does the payment have to be per student? And the answer is, that not necessarily, but you need to look back at your approved application, right? So in your approved application, there was a selection criteria about the per student cost and whether that was reasonable for the services and objectives you were providing. So if you already had in there something about per student cost, you probably want to make sure that your contracts are reflecting that per student cost. You might want to, we've also gotten the question about having a base rate plus a per student cost. So maybe the service provider gets paid, X number of dollars, and then there's a per student cost on top of that. Again, that's potentially acceptable, but you have to take into consideration all of these other factors that go into it, like how are you presenting choices to parents, and making sure that if you're setting up your contracts that way, that is matching with what you've said in your approved application about how you're going to spend funds. So it can be a little bit fact specific depending on your application. So if you have questions about that, you want to, again, reach out to Bianca and she'll give you the answers. Next, the 4.3 is location, time, and date. Again, you just want to be really clear about when the services are going to be provided, and where, and the times, just so that there's not any ambiguity about what you're expecting of the service providers or what they're expecting of you. And also so that information can be clearly communicated to the parents who are going to register their students. 4.4 is about capacity. Not only do you want to, well, not only would we recommend talking about the maximum number of students that can be in an activity. So for example, when Bianca had those examples up earlier about language, drumming, and math tutoring, the instructor or the service provider who's doing the math tutoring might obviously know the maximum number of kids we can have per week is 30 kids, because that's how many tutors we have. That's important to know. It's also important that that service provider and you think about what's the minimum number of students that can be in that class. So for example, if only 2 kids sign up for math tutoring and you're paying this service provider on a per student basis, maybe that service provider only gets paid for 2 kids per week. That might not be enough money to make it worth it for that service provider. So that's one of the things to really think about, is that, what's the maximum that service provider can accommodate, and also what's the minimum that service provider can have, and still have it be worth it financially for that service provider to do the service. So 4.4 talks about capacity, and then when we get to the end about termination, there's also a section about how you can terminate if you don't have enough kids in the class. 4.5 is modification. Just make sure that again, we recommend making sure that any modifications to a contract, just in general, be in writing and be really clear, so that, again, everyone understands what the expectations are, and so that it's very clear that you all grantees are being good stewards of the grant money here. Next slide, or is it the best practices?
And we actually had one quick question on this
Oh, sure.
particular slide. So they said there's going to be some instances when service providers will offer services as their business as usual, meaning they already have their regular clientele and they're just adding to their enrollment with students that are part of our contracted agreements. So they're trying to understand better the negotiated rates.
So I think we might have to think about this one a little bit more. So for example, let's say there's a company that does math tutoring, and they already have a class of 20 kids, and the grantee wants to add 5 more kids to that class that already exists.
Yes.
Okay, so like in that example, that's just something that you're going to have to work out with the service provider. I would ask, what is their cost? What is that service provider's cost per student for the 20 kids, right? How much does it cost them to run that program? How much are they paying the teacher? How much does it cost for the space and the supplies? Divide that by 20. And then maybe that's going to give you, sort of a reasonable per student cost for the next 5 students. That would be my suggestion as a starting point. But, I think it sort of depends on what you come up with the service provider.
Great. They said that helped. So perfect.
Okay, great. Let's see. And again, just as a best practice, make sure the provider understands the annual cost per student when determining minimum and maximum capacity. So, just make it really clear for that service provider. They are signing up to provide this. They are going to provide this service if they have X number of kids, which is going to give them, this amount of money, or up to, a lot more kids, which is going to give them that amount of money. Just make sure that they really clearly understand the bounds of the contract so that they can plan to provide a high quality service. Next slide, please. Okay, measuring student progress. This is section 5. I just want to call out that the NIA requires a description of how students' progress will be measured. So the NIA requires that in your written agreement with a service provider, there must be a description of how students' progress will be measured. That can look like what we have here in the sample, which we sort of have a couple sentences and then some fill in the blanks. Or that can be a different way, maybe that you already have set up with some of your providers, or maybe that's already in one of your standard agreements for your organization. Just the requirement is that there's a description of how students' progress will be measured, and that has to be in your agreement with service providers. Some of the things that you might want to drill down into is, what are we measuring based on? What's the metric? How often is it being measured? Is it going to be every week, every month, etc.? Who's doing the measuring? So is it the service provider is going to be doing that every week or every month, or does the grantee have to do it? Or maybe it's coming, some other external thing like student scores on a test that they take in school, something like that. Who's responsible for tracking? These are all really sort of management questions that it would be helpful for you all to think through and put in this agreement. Just as an example, maybe for a native language class, maybe you have a pre-test and a post-test that could be developed during your planning period. That's something that you as the grantee could work on during the planning period, and then that's something that the grantee could give to the service provider and say, hey, administer this. Or you could say to the service provider, as part of your, as part of us putting kids in your class, one of the things you have to do is give a pre-test and a post-test and report those results to us, on these specific intervals. Up to you. Just make sure that you've got a plan for how you're going to do it. Let's see. Next is about reporting, and I alluded to this a second ago. How often is progress going to be reported, and how will it be reported? So that's student progress, and then also student attendance, which is a really important one. So you all need to decide and work with your service providers to figure out your plan for how you're going to pay them, and what about students who don't show up. I know that we've gotten questions about, let me see, where was that question?
It was like if a student
Oh yeah, if
is
a student
enrolled and
only
then
attends for 1 week, right? If
Yeah.
a student only attends for 1 week, can I still pay the provider the full allotment for that student? So you need to negotiate this with your service provider, right? Like if it's a class that only happens once per week, then maybe you pay that service provider every month. Maybe you pay them on the actual number of kids who attended every month, or maybe you pay them based on how many kids are enrolled every month, but every month they dropped the kids from the rolls who haven't showed up. So you end up not paying for them. You know, there are different ways that you can do that. Again, you just need to make sure that you are being a good steward of federal money. You need to use grant funds for costs that are reasonable and necessary. So I know that at previous presentations, you know, we've had a lot of conversation about reasonable and necessary costs. Those are in the uniform guidance to CFR 200.403 or something like that. Just need to figure out, you know, the way that you're paying those service providers. Is it normal? Is it consistent with your business practices, like the way that you pay other providers for other services? Is it prudent under the circumstances? Is it a sound business practice? You know, so you just need to figure out, as a sort of like common sense general business practice, the way that I'm paying for students, is it appropriate? Is it reasonable and necessary? And part of this, you know, reporting student attendance goes into that. So make sure that you have a plan for how your service providers are gonna report student attendance. And then additionally, there are GPRA measures that you all are required to report on as part of your annual performance report. And you also have grant objectives that you're going to report on, those objectives that you set up for yourself in your approved application. Really read through those, think through those, because if any of those require you to get information from service providers, which I'm sure that they do, make sure that you have a plan for how those service providers are going to give you that information so that you can fulfill your requirements for reporting. So if one of your measures is about, you know, increasing graduation rates, or that's probably not a good one, increasing student engagement in something, make sure that you are getting the information that you need in order to make sure that you can report in your APR all of the GEPRA measures and your grant objectives. So put that in your contract. Next slide, please. Okay, section 6 is management and oversight. So again, I just want to call out a couple things, or one thing in section 6. It's 6.2, and the title of this subsection is accountability. The NIA requires, so the regulations require that in your written agreements with service providers, you must include a description of how the grantee will oversee the service provider and hold that provider accountable for the terms of this written agreement. So even if you're not using the sample agreement Word document that you have in front of you today, your written agreement must include a description of how you, the grantee, is going to oversee the service provider and hold that provider accountable for the terms of this overall contract. So make sure that that is in there. Additionally, for subsection 6.1 enrollment, you just want to think, we recommend just thinking through how are kids going to get officially enrolled, right? I don't know, you know, every grantee has come up with a different plan for how they're going to have parents select their courses. Once the parent selects that course, how does that enrollment get communicated to the service provider? Something to think about. Subsection 6.4, anything else that that's just anything else that needs to be in place for a successful relationship between the grantee and the service provider. And then subsection 6.4, I think I said the numbering wrong. Subsection 6.4, you want to make sure that there's a way to modify this contract. So, you know, if you know, you find out that the way that you're enrolling kids with the service provider isn't working, you want to make sure that you have a little bit of flexibility there so that you can change it. Let me see. Okay. Next slide, please. Or I guess the best practices pop up, right? Right. So understand how the provider is going to, sorry, it's important for the provider to understand how the grantee needs students to select their particular service option. And it's also important for the grantee to understand what the provider needs in order to enroll the student in that particular service. So again, 6.1, think about how that's really, that communication between the grantee and the service provider is going to work. Next slide, please. Section 7 is about payment and financial requirements. 7.1 is just you, the grantee, and the service provider coming up for a plan with how you're going to pay that service provider. When are you going to pay them? When does the check go in the mail? All that sort of regular stuff that you all are used to, just sort of regular business processes. Make sure that's all in there. Subsection 7.2, federal cost principles, and subsection 7.3, generally accepted accounting principles. Those are both requirements in the NIA. So the specific language from the NIA is that every written agreement with a service provider must include, let me see, a description of how the grantee will oversee the service provider and hold that provider accountable for the use of federal funds, including compliance with generally accepted accounting principles and federal cost requirements. So again, you can refer back to the NIA, but those, if you don't use this sample Word document that we sent you, whatever contract you're using has to include those two pieces. Federal cost principles, which is the uniform guidance, and then also generally accepted accounting principles, which is just generally accepted accounting principles. Anyway, another place where it's important to denote, this is another place where it's important to denote how the annual cost per student will impact the provider's invoicing and payment. So again, we've talked about if there's a per student cost and you're paying based on, if there's a per student cost, again, you want to have it all figured out, how they're going to report to you how many kids came, how many kids were enrolled, all that sort of stuff, so that the invoicing and the payments all work the way that you want them to work. Next slide, please. Okay, section 8 is about student privacy. If you are an LEA, so if you are a school district, you are bound by the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA. You probably already think about FERPA all the time. If you are not an LEA, probably FERPA does not apply to you, but not necessarily. You'll have to do some investigation about that yourself. Regardless of whether or not you are an LEA or some other type of entity, you need to ensure that we strongly recommend that you put in your contract to make it clear that service providers need to comply with any applicable federal, state, local, tribal laws protecting student privacy. It might be the case that those applicable laws include FERPA. There are other parts in the federal regulations related to BIE funded schools. So if you are any of those entities, you probably are already aware of those student privacy requirements, and you just need to make sure that you are making your service providers aware that they're also going to be held to that standard. You'll see there's also in here subsection 8, which has a very long and lawyerly title of optional provision for grantees that are LEAs to non-consensually disclose FERPA-protected student education records or personally identifiable information contained therein to authorized representative for purposes of auditing or evaluating the demonstration grant. So what that very lawyerly, overly wordy title means is that if you, the grantee, are a school district and you want to go through the steps to make one of your service providers an authorized representative, which means that under FERPA, you can share student information without needing a parent signature or anything like that. If you want to go through the steps to officially make your service provider an authorized representative so that you can share information without needing parent signatures for the purposes of your GEPRA measures or any other sort of reporting on your objectives, you can do that. There's a way to do that. Talk to OIE, talk to Bianca for additional information, because we have some, we have like sort of a similar outline of the type of contract you could set up with that service provider to make them an authorized representative. But this is only possible for a grantee that is a school district. So it just doesn't apply to most people, or sorry, it doesn't apply to most grantees, I should say. So anyway, make sure you maintain student privacy with your service providers. Next slide, please. Section 9 is about non-discrimination. Again, if you do not use our agreement, that's fine. But according to the NIA, you need to have these non-discrimination clauses in every written agreement with your service providers. And the specific requirement from the NIA is, one second. The specific requirement from the NIA is that it needs to have, your written agreement needs to require the service provider to abide by all applicable non-discrimination laws with regard to students being served. For example, on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, or disability. Additionally, and this is also from the NIA, your service provider agreements need to prohibit the provider from discriminating among students who are eligible for services on the basis of affiliation with a particular tribe. So those two things need to be in your written agreements with service providers because the NIA makes it a requirement of the program. Next slide, please. Section 10, termination. The one to highlight here is 10.1, non-compliance. The NIA requires that your every agreement with the service provider include a section about how you can end the agreement if the service provider can't meet the terms of the agreement. So even if you don't use our sample, whatever written agreement you're using needs to include something that covers that. The other sections, 10.2, 10.3, 10.4, and 10.5, those are suggested those are suggested provisions. So for example, if you have 10.2, inadequate student progress, if you have a provider and the kids are not achieving what they're supposed to be achieving with that provider, it's reasonable to plan ahead of time to say to that provider, hey, if our kids aren't learning what they're supposed to, we're allowed to end our contract with you and try and find a different service provider for this service. Below minimum capacity, this one actually protects the service provider. And this is what we were talking about before. So, earlier in the contract, when you said maximum capacity and minimum capacity, this one gives the service provider an out to say, hey, I can only do this program. We agreed that I can only do this program if I have 5 kids who are enrolled. I only have 4 kids who are enrolled. So we just need to cancel this contract. It's financially not worth it to me to do it. 10.4 is mutual consent. If both sides say, hey, we don't want to do this anymore for whatever reason, again, you just want to have that laid out in your contract. And then subsection 10.5 is notice. Next slide, please. Because you really want to think through how much notice you will need from a provider to make sure that you and your students are not left in a lurch. Do you want to, do they need to give you 30 days? Do they need to give you 2 weeks? Whatever it is, just make sure that you spell out really clearly, it's not okay for the service provider to email you on Friday and say, hey, we're done. Don't send your kids on Monday. Be really clear about how much time you need so that you can get those kids accommodated or at least give the parents notice that there's going to be a pause while you look for a new service provider. Next slide. Effectiveness and date. This just says, this is just sign the contract, write the dates. It's pretty straightforward. What I do want to say here is that OIE does not have a requirement for ink signatures, physical signatures. For all we care, you can use electronic signatures. However, we know that some states, some localities, some tribes have their own requirements about how to sign contracts, and you need to follow those rules. So if your state or your local government doesn't have a requirement for ink signatures, that's great. We don't. Same thing with getting contracts notarized. OIE does not require you to get contracts notarized. However, if there's some other law or policy that applies to you, please follow that law or policy. Next slide. Again, this is just an overview. Let me look really quickly and see. The one other thing I did want to say was that we did get some questions earlier about, do I have to sign a separate contract for each activity? The answer to that is no. You need to have it's no / that's not the right way of looking at it. You need to have a written agreement with each service provider. So if you have a service provider that's doing 3 different things, that's great. Put them all in one contract. But with each service provider, you need to have a written agreement.
And we do have 2 other quick questions. Yeah. One is, so let's say they've made a 1-year contract, but now they want to continue it into the 2nd year. The service was super successful, so they want to keep it going. Do they have to go back out for competition?
That is probably going to be most likely to be controlled by what your state or local procurement laws are. I would have to double check, but I'm pretty sure that that would not be a requirement federally. But that's really the type of thing that it's going to be covered under your state or local laws around, how school districts have to procure things or how nonprofits have to procure things. That's really what you want to look to there.
And then the next one was, this grantee is in an urban setting, and they have a lot of students who need assistance, particularly with transportation, to even get then to the other services that they've provided. And their concern is that for those students who do need some of those more access related services, that if they're doing like, okay, you can have, a certain number of credits or a certain number of services, that those who need things like transportation won't then have access to the same amount of actual content services. They'll have less overall access to those supports. So is there a way that they can distinguish on the per student cost for direct services focused on access versus direct services focused on content?
So you could just say to your service providers when you're setting up the contract, you could say to every service provider, hey, service provider, as part of this contract, we expect you to provide transportation to every student who wants it, who's enrolled in your program. And because we're expecting that of you, we're actually going to pay you quite a bit more per student than we would otherwise if it was just math tutoring. Because now we're actually going to say you have to do math tutoring, plus you need to get them to and from. So you could just choose to build that into your contract, how you're setting up your agreement with your service providers. You could, have it as a separate choice, like you were saying. The way that you could do it is don't even use it. When we were talking about credits or dollars or whatever, you could just choose to totally take it out of that altogether. You could just say everybody gets 2 credits, everybody gets 3 credits, or everybody gets to pick 2 classes, pick your 2 classes. And if you want transportation, or if you need transportation, tell us. So you, the grantee internally, would just handle that yourself. And when you were budgeting, you'd estimate, 75% of our kids are going to need transportation. This is what it costs to transport them. So I'm just going to take that off the top of the money that's available for the other direct services. And then, you know, as you go forward, you can kind of adjust your budget as needed. Just make sure that you're not supplanting additional, you know, existing transportation. For example, if the school district already has, you know, regular bus service or, you know, school bus service, don't take that over. Uh, um, if you are the if oh sorry, so don't take that over. And just the other thing on my example a second ago, if you're going to do transportation and sort of like take, you know, if you have $1 million and you say, and you put aside 200,000 for transportation, and then you, the grantee, use that 200,000 to do transportation, you can either do that through a service provider, a separate service provider, or if you, the grantee, are equipped to do that, then you sort of become this, you become a service provider. So for that reason, the money that you're spending on transportation is part of the 80% requirement for direct services. It does not come out of your sort of administrative costs.
Okay. So we have a couple more questions. I want to just give the wrap-up information for those who may need to hop to other events because we are 2 minutes over, and then we'll come back to the questions in the chat box because I know they may be applicable to more than one person. But I do want to just first ask that if everybody could please fill out the feedback survey. It is super, super helpful. Sarah Whitehead has popped that over in the chat box for you, and it does take a very short amount of time. So if you could please just take a moment and do that. And then remind you about our upcoming events. So in December, we have our talking stick. You should have seen that that was moved yesterday. So that is now going to be on December 8th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. We also have our December office hours. That was something that was pretty popular in November and seemed helpful. So that's, again, an informal time when you can pop in, ask any questions that you might have, get feedback. Even if you just want to brainstorm about something, you can join us there on office hours and we can talk through. And then in January, there's been a lot of questions regarding if you are having personnel, so actual staff who are working for your organization providing direct services, and then also about types of services, allowable services, ideas for services. So we are going to be doing a webinar in January on personnel and services. That'll be on the 21st from 3 to 4. You should have the invite for the talking stick already, but I'll be sending out the personnel and services invite after this. Okay. If for some reason you do not have the invite for the talking stick, you can either pop your info in the chat box and I can grab it that way, or you're welcome to email us at oie at seiservices.com. And I'll put that up on the screen momentarily. So I'm going to go to the contact info as we do the last few questions. So the next one was, what if they're leasing a van to provide transportation?
So in that scenario, I assume the grantee is leasing the van.
Yes.
In that scenario, the grantee is doing a service provider job. And so they need to think of themselves when they're leasing that van, driving that van, they are being a service provider. I don't think everybody's situation is very different. And I know that in both urban settings and in rural settings, there are definitely real barriers to attendance and just kids being mobile. So if transportation is really important, then that's something you could do. But again, just make sure that everything, including the transportation, is a choice for the parents. You cannot say every student shall get on the bus because it is a requirement of this grant that all of the services are chosen by the parents. So that transportation also has to be something they select as well, even if at the end of the day, everybody does select it.
Great. What about, can you just follow your own organization's procurement policies?
I mean, yes, I assume your organization's existing procurement policies are lawful and legal. And as long as they're not inconsistent with the things that, the federal cost principles, the things in the uniform guidance, then yes.
Is providing internet service with a service provider or purchasing a hotspot an allowable service option?
You can
Yes.
chime in, Colin, if you
Yeah,
want.
go ahead, Bianca, please.
Yeah, so again, it would have to be something that's selected by the family. So if, as the service provider, if you wanted to have supplies as a service that you are providing, hotspots or internet can be something that is selected by the families. Again, the same thing if you're with the transportation, make sure that you, before you just buy a whole lot of things, that you're really getting that data from the field and from those families that you'll be serving, because you do not want to, lease a vehicle or think that you're going to be providing transportation when the students don't need it. Or the same thing with hotspots. There's a lot of federal programs that's helping with internet and connectivity. So, maybe by next year, when we are providing services, hotspots are those iPads or laptops may not be of interest. So definitely get your information from what's needed in the field before you purchase anything.
Yeah, and just one other thing I wanted to mention is that we've gotten questions about training. Hold on a second. Okay, so two other things. First, I know that I've said this in various ways, but I just want to be really clear. You can, if you have a standard contract that your organization uses, you can use that standard contract and then have an addendum or something similar, just like a last page that you staple on and everyone agrees to, that covers those requirements from the NIA. So, again, talk to your business manager, your contracts person. You could do those NIA requirements as an addendum to your standard contract. You don't necessarily need to get in there and rewrite all the little bits of your standard contract. But those things from the NIA do need to be in there somewhere. And then the other thing was that, because we've gotten questions, do not include in your contracts with service providers money for that service provider to go to a training, to go to professional development, to go to a conference. Do not put it in there. That is not allowable. We should not see any service provider contracts where you have a line item that says that the service provider is going to this training or this conference, because it is not permitted for you to spend money to specifically to increase the capacity of those service providers to do their job. If you are the service provider could absolutely decide that in order to be a better service provider, we are going to use some of the money that we earn by providing these services to go to a conference, to go to professional development. Absolutely. That's something that I think most businesses do all the time, is they use some of their money that they earn to make themselves better at their business. So think about it that way, but again, do not put things in your contract specifically about how you're going to pay the service provider to go to a PD or training or something like that.
Well, and what if our contracts come back lower than anticipated? So if we have $100,000 in contracts and through negotiations and the planning, it ends up being 80,000. How do we go about reallocating those funds?
You'll submit a budget revision to me. You can increase, contracts, increase a different contract. If you're a service provider, maybe there's more that you can do, but definitely anytime that there's a reduction in a contract and you have additional funds, please work with me so we can have a budget revision in place. We want to make sure that all funds are being used and drawn down before the project is over.
And then there was a question about equity versus equality. So equitable doesn't force us to be equal, right? We are not forced to spend the exact same amount of money on each student being served, as long as the students all have equitable access to the services. And the selections are all in a realm of reasonability within the context of all of those services being provided.
Correct. Yeah, like on the slides when I was presenting, we showed that, one student may have only $700 worth of service, student B may have 1,000, and student C may have the maximum of like 1,500. You can set that maximum, and of course, you don't have to force students to use all of the funds that's provided or the services that you're offering. But and again, the service costs do not have to be the same. So, tutoring may be a lot cheaper than a STEM camp. So make sure, the costs are associated well.
And then I think there's one final question. So if the grantee itself is one of the service providers providing direct service to students, can they pay for their staff to go to a conference to learn how to do a new skill or learn about new resources that would be available to implement with the participants?
So
No.
you've asked us the hardest possible question. Yeah, so for a grantee that is also a service provider, you're kind of wearing two different hats, right? So when you are the grantee, when you are wearing your grantee hats, you as the grantee can pay as part of your 20% overall limit for things, for professional development, for your staff to do their job as the staff of the grantee. If you have staff who are wearing the service provider hat, you should not spend money to send those folks to professional development so they can do a better job at being a service provider. That is what is not allowed. During your planning period, for example, when you don't have that 20%, 80% limit, during your planning period, for example, you could use funds to send your staff, your grantee staff, to learn how to do a better job at setting up their, for the parent selection and feedback, to set up the parent selection and feedback process. Any of that is fine, but just do not spend, really just stay away from spending money on professional development, even if it's for your own staff.
So another thing to consider too is that we cannot use these funds to increase the capacity of any of the service providers. So even you as a service provider, you have to pretty much be ready to go and implement when you're providing those services. So we're not using the funds to train or to create a whole new program or curriculum or something that is brand new. And everyone who's providing the services should be, are ready and prepared once that planning period is over, to go without, using any of the federal funds to increase that capacity.
Right, but then just like we were saying about something earlier, that service provider can absolutely use, some of the money that they're making by providing the service to do those things, to do those things themselves, to increase their capacity or to get better at their job. But we should not, that's because they're using the money that they've made in order to do that. But we should not see grantees providing funds for, specifically for a service provider to go to professional development or training or something like that.
Great. Well, I think we've covered all of the questions in the chat box. As you're starting to work through your contract process or steeping in this information after today, remember you can always reach out with any questions you might have. And then we will see all of you back on December 8th for the talking stick. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.